Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my matchday 5 cheat sheet. Now, we've seen all the sort of round of 16 games, and the results have actually gone pretty much as we expected, with exception to Austria-Turkey, which was already, labeled as the sort of outlying game. And as things stand, of course, England, got through the scrape of their teeth, which is something that we'll discuss as part of the video structure. But generally speaking, when I look at, for example, some of the odds when it comes to progression, it seems like England, for whatever reason, are still very much favored. Although I can completely understand people, fairly backing the Switzerland based on style of play and what they've shown in the tournament so far compared to England. On the other side, though, it seems like the Dutch team look like they have a pretty easy run towards the semi-final on paper. Now, Turkey were very, very aggressive, I would say, definitely versus Austria, but Austria still overwhelmed them, in my opinion, in the last sort of second half of football. And I do really think that ultimately the Dutch team might be able to sort of make their opportunities count, and arguably as well, when it comes to set piece defense, might be a little bit better than Austria, just because of when you look at players like Van Dijk, Verbruggen, definitely maybe a little bit better when it comes to the set piece aspect of things. Anyways, as far as obviously how we're sort of planning to use our transfers, I know some people will have to sort of transfer some of the failed punts. Myself, have to put my hands up. Pedri completely failed as a punt. Fabian Ruiz did well once again, which is not against my expectation, but definitely once again a 1 goal, 1 assist performance is definitely out of my expectation for Fabian. Also against the market expectations. Rodri, on the other hand, with 1 goal, despite it not being a penalty, of course, also very interesting. And it just sort of changes, in my opinion, the sort of positioning of the Spanish midfielders for me. And it also even calls into play potentially an almost start for matchday 5 for Spain. Otherwise, of course, a lot of people own some Italian players, some Austrian players, and those would need to be replaced as well as part of matchday 5. Now, in the budget positions in midfield, we have some Swiss midfielders, but I still think that they're probably not the type of picks that you want to go with. Ultimately, right now, you have to be quite frugal with your picks. You're probably going to pick players mostly within the Dutch team, because I think ultimately, a lot of people don't have too many Dutch players as things stand. The Dutch team are probably the safest team to actually back when it comes to going towards the semifinal. So if you don't have a wildcard chip, I would probably back the Dutch team. Whereas obviously, if you do have a wildcard chip, you have the opportunity, in my opinion, to maybe consider some other fixtures. But ultimately, I still think the Dutch fixture is so good that if you, for example, have a defensive sort of transfer to make, it's probably the team to target anyways. And as far as, going for, let's say, a forward, Gakpo is definitely there. A great downgrade from anyone like Ronaldo, Mbappe, or even Kane if you want to try and stretch into other players in other positions. So for me, Freuler, Abisher, even, for example, Vargas, these are all interesting for different reasons, right? We've seen all these sort of Swiss midfielders who are also playing on the wing as almost utility players, and they've all had their chance to shine, right? Freuler has got goals and assists. Abisher has got goals and assists. Vargas as well. So they've all got chances, in theory, to get player of the match, although Xhaka has gotten 2 player of the matches. So different routes towards getting points for the Swiss midfielders here, but all of them quite effective. The only issue, of course, is how much do you trust, I think, that intuitive feel of just seeing England play and thinking that they might be overwhelmed by a little bit more of a composed team like Switzerland, who have actually been very robust within this tournament so far. Now, if you're backing odds, of course, it is expected that Switzerland will falter against the English, and you'll have to sort of make your decision there. So it's really a case, I think, here of data versus grass, potentially, and whether you're willing to go against the market. Schoten, I think, is also an interesting pick, but only because he had a great performance for the Dutch team. I think we also saw Reinders play really well, and his minutes seem to look really secure, but as I said, you're probably not going to be looking at these picks. And Güler as well, great performance versus Austria, but I'm still expecting, unfortunately, for Turkey to sort of falter versus the Dutch. And for that reason, for me, a differential right now. As far as the other picks here in the 6.5 position, this is where you really have, I think, the cream of the crop, right? Fabian Ruiz and Rodri, despite actually having a tougher fixture, I just think that ultimately we've reached the stage of the tournament where the midfield position is quite condensed. A lot of the great attackers in the tournament either don't look as good as attackers, for example, some of the English ones, or on the flip side, ultimately you have such a dominant team like Spain, who, even though they have such a tough matchup, have 2 key players in the midfield like Fabian Ruiz and Rodri. And for this tournament so far, of course, with Fabian Ruiz, he's just been incredible. With Rodri, we expect him to get a lot of avenues towards points, and we're still waiting eagerly for that penalty. Although, as things have sort of gone within this tournament, it might be the case that he doesn't take it. But No, as I said, I do think Rodriguez will be the penalty taker. I think the best case example of the most recent Spanish penalties being taken was that friendly versus Brazil, which ended 3-3. Rodri took a penalty, I believe, at around 12-16 minutes when Morata was on the field. So, expecting that the Spanish 11 will be exactly the same, Rodri should be the penalty taker. Çalhanoğlu, once again, a differential, probably someone that I wouldn't really consider right now. At the 7 million position, though, I believe it's really Williams, who is still that sort of leading pick, and then Xavi Simons, just because Xavi Simons, has very good chances to advance deep into this tournament and has a great fixture here versus Turkey. I also think that he's played a little bit better recently, too. I think a lot of people coming to the tournament were a little bit unconfident in terms of Simons being a part of that Dutch team and being able to actually actively produce. He's not necessarily done that. He's only got one assist so far, I believe. And of course, a disallowed goal. But given the fact that, once again, this is a very, very nice fixture, I do like the idea of going for Xavi Simons. As far as, let's say, Gundogan, unfortunately, with him losing penalties and him giving that sort of most recent penalty to Havertz, the dream is, officially gone. And ultimately, when it comes to, let's say, the German team, you're also sort of pitting the German team versus the Spanish team. So I do think that it's a case here where I probably drop Gundo in my estimations, but I think if you've kept Gundo in your team, there's absolutely no reason to move off of Gundo right now. I still think he's a brilliant pick. And so for that reason, he still stays as a green pick for the time being. As far as Pedri, he's completely dropped for me. I think in terms of all the Spanish players who are most susceptible to being rotated, and keep in mind, of course, between Spain and Germany, you will get the lineups anyways when it comes to matchday 5. So we will be on the deadline stream. We'll be able to sort of react to the Spanish lineup. My expectations is that Pedri will start again, but I would say it's a 55% chance that Pedri starts and the 45% chance that Olmo starts. And that's the only sort of position of sort of doubt within the Spanish team. And of course, when you can see the substitutions and the timings of the substitutions for Pedri so far in the tournament, you can see that, unfortunately, that just makes him not a great pick. I did try to go for Pedri. I thought it was a great differential to go for, just in terms of some of the attacking positions that I've seen him in. Didn't really work out. Definitely an L, and we have to go back to the drawing board, and he probably has to be replaced come around the deadline for me within my own team. With Wirtz, I also think with the sort of the poor minutes, ultimately, he could start again, but I think he's also very prone to being substituted. So despite obviously us seeing, early Musiala subs, early Gundo subs, I think Musiala, as I said, always should have the best minutes within the German team. So I like him the most from that perspective. And then it's Gundogan, and then it's Wirtz for me. And so because of that, I do think that Wirtz, unfortunately, is just not exactly an exciting pick anymore. Olmo, of course, if he gets to start for Spain, you might want to be tempted. But of course, you can see the flip side with situations like Pedri and Olmo, where they just simply don't play enough minutes, and some of the other Spanish players will play more minutes and be more involved, and that makes a huge difference. As far as the 8.5 million position, Musiala stays as the king here. As I said, I think he's got really good minutes. Saka, unfortunately, does fall for me, and I think part of that too is because despite me thinking that Saka will likely start the next game once again, ultimately his minutes are a little bit worse, and it's very clear, of course, the structure in place that Saka starts in, and of course Switzerland being actually a very compact, robust team with really good sort of defending around the wing areas. I just think that this will be a tougher game for Saka, and ultimately, as I said, the minutes are now worse and worse for players like Saka and probably Foden as well. Whereas obviously when it comes to, let's say, Bellingham and Kane, I still think their minutes are very strong. So that's sort of the changing in the estimation of Saka and Foden for me. Bernardo Silva still, yes, of course, he does get into interesting positions for Portugal. You'll see him at times, getting into the box, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Bernardo's a great pick. And unfortunately as well, I just think France is such a defensive team and, in my opinion, also favored to win. So the value for Bernardo Silva is just not there for me. And you can arguably apply the same logic to Fernandes as well, although I think he's a little bit more illustrative in terms of, in general, when Portugal play. Of course, so far, this has been a very, very dull tournament for Bruno, but as things stand, I'd drop him as well, simply because of that sort of tough fixture versus France. And with Bellingham, he gets a rise because, yes, of course, whilst England have been terrible, the reality is his minutes are very good, and of course, he's been a key part of their sort of goal contributions within this tournament. So because of that, simply, when it comes to production, we just have to give sort of value to Bellingham and his ability to produce, and that's why he also rises within the cheat sheet. In the forward position, we have not too many changes. There's only changes around the sort of Gakpo, Morata, Depay position, and that's simply because Morata, of course, coming out of the George game, I don't think our expectations for his minutes have changed at all. But the main thing for Morata, of course, and him falling is ultimately Morata is going to be facing two tough opponents from here on out. So ideally, of course, if you have the luxury of really being able to move out of Morata, it's simply a move towards Gakpo or Depay. Didn't convert versus Georgia, but of course 65 out of 90 minutes in a game where they scored 4 goals, you'd expect something from Morata, and he didn't produce, which is as things go sometimes in fantasy. So he gets a drop. Ronaldo, for the similar sort of reasons to why I've dropped some of the other Portuguese attackers, simply because I think the France game is so much tougher, he drops as well. I think, of course, if you don't have the luxury of sort of wasting free transfers, unless you literally need to downgrade from Ronaldo, you probably should be keeping Ronaldo anyways. But I can completely understand someone going from Ronaldo to Gakpo simply because that gives you luxury to actually upgrade into the key players that you want within the midfield and defensive positions. For now, I'm very tempted by something like Morata to Gakpo. I've also given Depay a rise because at the end of the day, Depay is simply versus a Turkish team that have conceded a lot of expected goals within this tournament. So as Turkey looked like the worst remaining defensive team left, although they had a great save from Gunok in the last minute versus Baumgartner, the reality is I think chances will come for the Dutch team. And of course, Gakpo and Depay look brilliant from that sort of perspective. And Morata drops, Ronaldo drops as well. Potentially, you can even argue that these are now orange picks too. Whereas Mbappe and Kane, I still like Mbappe because, of course, he is a talisman for France, even though they've been extremely boring, haven't been able to score in open play yet. For me, if they were ever to score, I think it would still come through him. And then for Kane, we've still seen that he can score. He will stay probably and play good, consistent minutes for the most part for this English team. And ultimately, he has a lot of routes towards points, like penalties, even though, of course, you can miss penalties, as we saw Ronaldo miss one recently. With Yamal, I've kept him up because I think his minutes are better than Morata. And, of course, there is now a little bit of value to price point, right? If you want to upgrade your midfield to players like Bellingham and Musiala, you kind of need players like Yamal or Gakpo or Depay within your team to sort of really enjoy the maximum value within the 105 million transfer budget. As far as moving on towards the defense now, a lot of changes here, but of course keep in mind, as I said, that we will have the Spain and Germany lineup. So for players like Mittelstadt and Schlotterbeck, you will find out whether they start. Schlotterbeck, as we've mentioned before previously on the channel, ball recoveries are really good with him, although Rudiger did outshine him in the previous match. He did get an assist anyways though, so I think Schlotterbeck had a great game with maybe one mistake there versus Højlund. For the most part though, I think he played really well, and I think he could start again. And of course, if you like a little bit of a differential who's not going to be highly owned in this tournament, Schlotterbeck is your person at 4.5. Lenormand, I've actually kept him at the top here and given Cucurella a drop. Now, part of that is because I think the Grimaldo substitution was a little bit of a shock to me in terms of how early that was. I don't think necessarily it's the case that Cucurella is going to be dropped for the next game, but there is, of course, a possibility that Grimaldo can continue to take minutes away from Cucurella. And of course, the flip side of that is that means less chances to get ball recoveries, because, of course, if you get subbed off early compared to the center backs, as we've seen in this tournament, particularly with extra time being a possibility, players like Lenormand or even Laporte are going to be better than Cucurella anyways, if, let's say, a substitution is due. I don't think center back substitutions will really happen in this tournament for Spain, but definitely the fullback substitutions can happen. So for me, Lenormand is top. And he also got more ball recoveries, and I think he's more ball recovery dominant compared to Laporte. Mittelstadt, I think, still a fantastic pick if he starts, but of course that is a big if right now, because Rom has back-to-back played 2 pretty good games for Germany, and that could change the sort of starting lineup within Germany's backline. And the same goes for Schlotterbeck too. As far as, let's say, the 5 million position, I've actually given Akanji sort of, a complete sort of, respectful introduction towards the sort of green tier. And of course, Akanji was someone I definitely missed. Some people actually very rightly commented, what about Akanji within the previous cheat sheet video? I responded in most cases saying that he was a great pick. And of course, he had a great performance as well within his match versus Italy. I think here versus England, of course, it's a tougher match on paper, but Akanji has just been so good at ball recoveries within this tournament. Even if there's, let's say, a high chance that they lose to England, I still think that he is an amazing pick to go for within this position. Because as you can see, out of all the sort of center backs that we have, or even defenders, Akanji still remains supremely close towards the top, and that makes him very interesting. And the same goes with Pepe as well, who, despite being subbed off late and making a key mistake versus Benjamin Sesko, I still think that he will stay within that sort of starting position for Portugal. And because he's so good at ball recoveries, once again, he should be someone that you might be considering just for that aspect, because it can get you so many points as it has been proven so far. And of course, because these sort of games between Spain, Germany, and France, Portugal are a little bit tougher to call, backing someone who has more guaranteed points like the ball recoveries makes a lot of sense because the clean sheets are quite variable. De Vrij has been added to the cheat sheet as well. Just a fantastic pick. Ultimately, it probably makes more sense now to stack a little bit more heavily into that Dutch team. No minutes have really been lost for De Vrij, whereas someone like Ake has had less minutes. And for that reason, I think it makes more sense to prioritize someone like De Vrij. And the same goes with like the Dumfries as well. Even though I've given Dumfries a rise because we finally saw a great performance from him versus Romania, I still prefer the ball recoveries and the guarantees that you can get from De Vrij and Van Dijk. And so for that reason, we've given them the sort of respect that they deserve with sort of rises there. As far as the French defense, I do think they've actually been a little bit lower on the end of ball recoveries, and part of that is because of, I suppose, the way they play, also the sort of role of Kante within the team. But yeah, I think Upamecano, Koundé, Saliba, it's very hard to pick between all of these players. I probably also wouldn't necessarily be going for them simply because they haven't been that good at ball recoveries, and I don't think there's that much of guarantee from the French team. But if you want to back the French team and you think that they will sort of make it out of this bracket, I can kind of understand backing some of these defenders, although I really just think that there's not too much interchangeable and none of the statistics are really super alarming for them, apart from the fact that Koundé, of course, just recently got man of the match for his great performance in the previous game versus Belgium. As far as Stones, because he unfortunately is someone who, you know, will not be getting as many ball recoveries, I still think I have to keep him at that sort of yellow tier. And the same goes with, let's say, Nuno Mendes with an ultimately tougher matchup where he's expected still to get less ball recoveries. Him and Cancelo have dropped because in a tougher game, I think the opportunity, right, to get ball recoveries is still very high. Whereas in a tougher game, the opportunity to get attacking opportunities, let's say for Nuno Mendes or Cancelo, are going to be lower. And so that's why I've given a bit more credence towards ball recoveries within this stage of the tournament compared to the last stage. And that's simply what it comes down to. As far as Dumfries, he still gets a rise just because he's part of that Dutch defense. And of course, he does have a bit more of a one-sided matchup, so definitely someone to consider. Van Dijk rising as well for that reason. And Trippier and Diaz, you know, Diaz has been really poor at ball recoveries. So ultimately, when you see that there's always a partnership pair within this tournament, one center back is usually a bit more dominant, and as we've seen so far, that tends to be pairs like Pepe within the Portuguese combo, Guehi so far for England, but of course we know that someone like Konsa or Dunk might step in. I would probably pick Konsa or Dunk, but I'm not necessarily sure who would actually start right now for England in that position. And of course, Trippier coming off in the previous game. We'll see what happens there. It might be Konsa playing, but anyways, anyone sort of deputizing within that fullback position is probably not going to get too many ball recoveries, or, for example, going to be on set pieces like Trippier was. So that's something to consider and to take into consideration. As far as the goalkeepers, there are absolutely no changes, really, with exception to Manuel Neuer getting a rise. As we sort of trickle down later into the tournament, of course, you know, whoever comes out of that Spain versus, let's say, Germany match is probably expected to come out of the semifinals as well. So I do think that sort of just giving respect to that just makes sense. But for the time being, my best keepers, in my opinion, are still Verbruggen, Pickford, Costa, and Simon. And that's pretty much it. Thank you guys so much for watching the cheat sheet. Hope you guys are enjoying the tournament so far. I'll see you guys soon with more content, and take care and goodbye.